She was my friend's mom, confident, graceful, and utterly untouchable. And somehow, she started noticing me too. It started on an ordinary Saturday afternoon, the kind that smells faintly of cut grass and brewing coffee. I was at my friend's house, waiting for him to finish a weekend errand. I had known the place all my life, the living room with the faded blue couch, the shelves lined with dog-eared novels, and the soft hum of the ceiling fan. But today it felt different, somehow heightened. She was there. My friend's mom. I'd seen her before, of course, at school events or neighborhood barbecues, but never like this, alone, leaning casually against the kitchen counter, her posture effortless, yet contained, like a dancer holding herself mid-pose. She noticed me immediately. Not in a way that demanded attention, but in a way that made me self-conscious. Our eyes met, and for a moment, the mundane world of dust motes and afternoon light disappeared. She smiled softly, a kind of smile that carried warmth but also a hint of mischief, like she knew a secret I hadn't yet discovered. I was 19 then, caught in that strange liminal space between adolescence and adulthood, while she moved through the room with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen more summers than I had birthdays. There was an ease in the way she moved, her hand brushing a stray strand of hair behind her ear, the subtle tilt of her head as she listened to a voicemail on her phone, her bare feet shifting against the cool tile. I noticed these small details, not because I intended to, but because they drew me in without asking. I tried to act natural, leaning against the doorway with a casual shrug, but inside, I was painfully aware of the gap between us. I felt inexperienced, clumsy even, yet her presence didn't intimidate me, it fascinated me. There was something comforting in her laughter when she spoke to my friend on the phone, a softness that made the room feel alive. When she hung up, she looked at me and offered a faint nod, a quiet acknowledgement that somehow, in that fleeting moment, felt intimate. Then she moved closer, carrying a plate of cookies she had baked earlier. The scent of vanilla and cinnamon drifted toward me, warm and homey. She held the plate out, and our fingers brushed slightly when I reached for one. It was a small, almost accidental touch, yet it sparked a strange awareness in me, a recognition that connection doesn't always announce itself loudly. We talked then, about inconsequential things, the weather, a new book she was reading, my friend's questionable taste in music. But even in these small exchanges, there was a rhythm to our conversation, a subtle give and take that left me listening more closely to her than anyone else had in a long time. Her voice carried a calm authority, but also a softness that made me want to linger just a moment longer in her presence. By the time my friend returned, I realized something had shifted. The house, the sunlight, even the cookies on the counter, they all felt like part of a story that had just begun. And I knew, deep down, that the spark I felt in that quiet living room was only the start of something that would slowly, inevitably, change everything I thought I knew about attraction, patience, and the strange beauty of emotional connection. The days that followed felt almost suspended in quiet anticipation. I found myself thinking about her more than I expected, her laugh echoing softly in the kitchen, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear, the gentle crease of her brow when she read a note or checked her phone. At first, I tried to dismiss it as harmless admiration. After all, she was my friend's mom, gracefully confident and unattainably composed. But there was a weight to her presence that I couldn't ignore, a warmth that lingered long after she had left the room. It started with small encounters. I'd help carry groceries from the car, and she'd glance up with that soft, knowing smile, lingering just enough that I felt my chest tighten in ways I didn't understand. Or she'd invite me to sit with her for a cup of tea while my friend sorted out his own chores. The steam from the cup curled between us, carrying the subtle aroma of chamomile and honey, and I became aware of how close she sat, just far enough to respect boundaries but near enough that the space between us seemed charged. There was an elegance to her movements, something in the fluidity of her gestures that drew my attention without asking for it. When she reached for the sugar, her fingers brushed mine, barely noticeable, yet it sent an unspoken current through me. I caught myself studying the way the afternoon sunlight softened the lines of her face, how her eyes seemed to reflect memories and wisdom I hadn't yet earned. There was no rush, no expectation, just the quiet, deliberate unfolding of a connection neither of us fully understood yet. I started noticing her emotional rhythms too. Her voice changed when she spoke to someone she cared about, lighter and more melodic. Her smile deepened when she laughed at something genuinely funny, not performatively. And her gaze, fleeting as it was, sometimes lingered just a moment longer on me, a subtle acknowledgement of a shared space in the quiet hum of the day. I wondered what she thought of me, if she noticed the way I studied these little details or the way my hand unconsciously brushed against objects near her, seeking some excuse for proximity. Our conversations grew gradually richer. She asked about my studies, my interests, the small triumphs and frustrations of my week. I found myself opening up in ways I didn't with anyone else, drawn to the calm, non-judgmental presence she offered. And every time she listened, every time her fingers lightly touched mine when passing a book or adjusting a curtain, I felt a deepening tension, an unspoken awareness of something uncharted, fragile, and profoundly stirring. By the end of the week, I realized that the spark from our first encounter had evolved into something subtler but more insistent. It was no longer about fleeting glances or accidental touches. It was about presence, about noticing the unspoken textures of her world and the quiet, steady pull it exerted on me. Every shared smile, every soft word, every brush of her hand became a gentle confirmation that the connection was real, and that, despite the gap between us, something quietly profound was beginning to grow. It happened one rainy evening, the kind where the sky seems to press down on the world and every sound, raindrops on the roof, the occasional distant car, feels amplified. I had stopped by my friend's house to return a borrowed textbook, expecting the usual casual chatter. Instead, I found her sitting by the window, a soft blanket draped over her shoulders, a half-empty mug of tea warming her hands. The room smelled faintly of rain-soaked earth and vanilla, a comforting mix that made the space feel unusually intimate. She glanced at me as I stepped in, her eyes catching mine with a flicker of surprise that quickly softened into warmth. "I didn't expect anyone," she said, her voice low and gentle, like she had been speaking to herself more than to me. There was a quietness in her demeanor, a subtle heaviness in her shoulders that made me pause. Something in her posture told me she wasn't just relaxed, she was burdened. I hesitated, then stepped closer, drawn by a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Is everything okay?" I asked, my voice quieter than intended, almost swallowed by the sound of rain. She gave a small, almost shy smile, as if weighing whether to let me in. "It's just been a long week," she admitted, and I noticed the slight tremor in her fingers as she wrapped them around her mug. The vulnerability in that moment caught me off guard. Here was someone who always seemed so composed, so effortlessly poised, letting the weight of her world slip just enough for me to glimpse it. Without thinking, I pulled a chair closer and sat across from her. The warmth from my body seemed to mingle with the warmth of her tea, and for the first time, I felt a kind of closeness that was entirely emotional yet felt tangible. We didn't speak immediately, just shared the quiet rhythm of the rain, the occasional clink of her spoon against the mug, and the soft sighs that filled the spaces between us. Then she spoke, hesitantly, about her frustrations and small disappointments, the worries that came with balancing work, family, and personal dreams. Her voice wavered at first, but grew steadier as I listened, nodding and responding with care, offering nothing but attention and understanding. Every once in a while, our hands brushed lightly when she shifted her mug, each contact sending a small, electric reminder of our growing awareness of each other. I realized in that moment that connection wasn't always about grand gestures or dramatic confessions. It could live in quiet vulnerability, in the courage to let someone see your cracks without fear of judgment. And she, effortlessly and unconsciously, had invited me into her world in a way no one else had. By the time I left that evening, the rain had stopped, and the streets glistened under the soft light of lampposts. I walked away with a strange, warm heaviness in my chest, a mix of admiration, longing, and the thrilling uncertainty of being trusted with someone's quiet truths. That night, I understood that the slow burn of attraction wasn't just physical or visual. It was emotional, deeply human, and it had begun in the most subtle, unassuming way. A few weeks later, our encounters became more frequent, yet the rhythm of them carried an unspoken tension. I noticed the way she lingered near doorways, waiting to say something small, but meaningful. The way her eyes met mine for a heartbeat longer than necessary. There was an elegance in her hesitation, a subtle acknowledgement that something unspoken was developing, yet both of us were careful not to cross invisible lines. It was on a Saturday morning, with sunlight streaming through half-open blinds, that the tension became almost tangible. I had come over to drop off a book my friend had borrowed, but she was in the living room, sorting through a pile of papers at the coffee table. Her hair was loosely pinned back, a few strands falling softly around her face, catching the light and giving her an ethereal quality. She looked up as I entered, and we both paused, two people aware of a quiet, shared understanding that words could not yet capture. "I was just going through some old letters," she said, her voice calm but with a subtle tremor that betrayed vulnerability. She motioned toward the couch, and I sat, careful not to close the space completely, but not too far away either. The distance between us felt deliberate, yet in the charged quiet, even that small space seemed intimate. As she handed me one of the letters to read, our fingers brushed. It was almost accidental, but the warmth of her skin against mine lingered longer than it should have, leaving a trace of awareness that neither of us acknowledged immediately. I felt my chest tighten, my thoughts scattered, yet I reminded myself that caution was necessary. The age difference, the social boundaries, and the natural rhythm of life all whispered against what my heart was beginning to notice. She spoke softly about the contents of the letters, memories, regrets, small joys. And I listened, drawn to the honesty and quiet strength in her voice. Every word she shared seemed to peel away another layer, revealing a depth that went beyond appearances. I realized that attraction wasn't just about desire, it was about admiration, trust, and the recognition of vulnerability. Then, without meaning to, I reached out to brush a stray lock of hair from her cheek. It was a gentle, fleeting touch, and I saw her inhale softly, a subtle shift in her expression that spoke volumes. Neither of us spoke about it. We simply returned to the quiet rhythm of the morning, aware of a magnetic pull between us but restrained by hesitation. By the time I left, my mind was restless. I replayed every glance, every brush of our hands, and every unspoken word. The slow burn had intensified, no longer just curiosity or admiration, it had become longing tempered with caution. I understood that the emotional tension was not something to rush. It was something to feel, to savor, to let grow naturally, as fragile and exquisite as a seedling reaching for sunlight. And in that restraint, I sensed the promise of something enduring, a connection that could survive patience, distance, and hesitation, a love that was as much about understanding and presence as it was about fleeting moments of closeness. It was late evening when the moment arrived, unexpected, quiet, and profoundly stirring. I had stopped by my friend's house to return some notes I'd borrowed for class. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the room bathed in soft amber light from the kitchen lamp. She was in the living room, curled up on the sofa with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, reading a novel. The sight of her there, serene and luminous in the muted glow, stopped me for a moment. She looked up as I entered, her eyes locking with mine. There was a pause, long enough to feel like a heartbeat stretched across seconds. I noticed, again, the gentle way her lips curved, the subtle sparkle in her eyes that seemed to acknowledge something unspoken between us. This time, the tension didn't feel like hesitation or curiosity, it felt like recognition. Something we had both felt for weeks had surfaced fully, and neither of us had to articulate it. "Hey," I said softly, my voice almost swallowed by the quiet. "Hey," she replied, a smile flickering across her face, tentative but warm. It wasn't playful or teasing, this smile carried something more weighty, a quiet acknowledgement of feelings that had long been unspoken. I hesitated before sitting down, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her presence but careful to respect the invisible boundary we had maintained. She shifted slightly, and our knees brushed ever so lightly. It was a brief contact, yet it felt electric, a gentle reminder of the intimacy building between us. We began talking, about everything and nothing. About the books we were reading, the subtle changes in the neighborhood, the routines we had fallen into without noticing. But beneath the surface of casual conversation, there was a current of something deeper. Every laugh, every sigh, every quiet glance carried weight. Every subtle gesture, her hand resting lightly on the blanket, my fingers adjusting a stray book on the coffee table, felt laden with unspoken meaning. Then came the moment of vulnerability that shifted everything. She looked at me, her gaze steady, and said, "I enjoy these quiet moments. With you. More than I expected." Her words were simple, yet they carried an honesty that struck me in the chest. I felt my throat tighten, my pulse quicken. I wanted to respond with the same sincerity, but words felt insufficient to capture the intensity of the recognition. Instead, I reached out, gently brushing a loose strand of hair from her cheek. She didn't pull away. Her eyes softened, and for the first time, it felt like we were both entirely present in the same space, fully aware of what had been growing between us. There was no rush, no pressure, just a mutual acknowledgement that the slow burn we had nurtured was no longer hidden. By the time I left that night, the world outside felt different. The air seemed heavier, yet more vibrant, carrying the unspoken promise of something profound. For the first time, I knew that our connection was real, not fleeting curiosity, not admiration, but something quietly transformative. And I understood that this recognition, tender and restrained, was the true peak of our slow burn romance, the point where longing, care, and emotional intimacy converged, leaving us both on the brink of something unforgettable. The days after that evening were quieter, yet heavier with unspoken awareness. Something had shifted between us, an invisible line had been crossed, and the world seemed different for both of us, even if no words had changed. I felt it in the way her gaze lingered when I entered a room, in the subtle warmth of her smile, and in the small gestures that had become laden with meaning, a hand resting on the counter while she brewed coffee, the brush of her fingers against mine as she handed me a book, the soft, almost imperceptible leaning toward me during conversation. Each touch, each glance, felt like a step along a path we were both hesitant to name. But hesitation remained, a quiet obstacle neither of us could ignore. The age difference, the social boundaries, the reality of her being my friend's mother, all of it weighed on me. I questioned myself constantly. Was it admiration, or something deeper? Was it appropriate to feel this way, to notice the warmth in her laugh, the comfort in her presence, the subtle pull of her hand near mine? I caught myself overanalyzing every interaction, fearing that my awareness might betray the delicate balance we had built. She, too, seemed to wrestle with her own restraint. There were moments when she would pause mid-sentence, her eyes softening as if weighing the implications of what she might say or do. Once, while we were rearranging books on a shelf together, our hands touched accidentally, and she didn't pull away. Instead, her fingers lingered for a heartbeat longer than necessary, and we both laughed lightly to cover the sudden electricity between us. That shared laughter, nervous, tentative, but genuine, was a subtle bridge, a reminder that trust and understanding could coexist with restraint. We began to confide in one another more deeply, sharing small fears and personal reflections. I spoke about the uncertainty of early adulthood, the pressure of decisions I wasn't yet ready to make. She shared quiet anxieties about balancing her responsibilities and personal desires, the weight of experience that sometimes felt isolating. In those moments, the age difference mattered less than the emotional honesty we offered one another. Her voice, calm and measured, felt like a grounding presence, and I found solace in listening, in being heard, and in the mutual care that quietly grew between us. There were days when the tension felt almost unbearable, glances that lasted too long, brushes of our hands, the weight of our unspoken attraction, but rather than forcing a reckoning, we let it breathe. We honored the slow pace, the necessity of emotional patience, and the delicate trust forming between us. Every touch, every laugh, every quiet moment together became a small but meaningful act of connection, each one reinforcing the bond we were building carefully, intentionally. By the end of this period, I realized that trust wasn't just about honesty. It was about restraint, respect, and the shared understanding that our feelings, though complicated, were valid and real. And in that quiet acknowledgement, I understood the beauty of the slow burn, the anticipation, the emotional depth, and the thrill of knowing that, when the time was right, our connection could fully blossom without fear or regret. The resolution of our story didn't come with fireworks or dramatic declarations. It came quietly, like the gentle unfolding of dawn after a long, uncertain night. By the time the weekend arrived, the slow tension that had built between us had transformed into a comfortable, warm familiarity. We had learned to navigate the delicate line between attraction and propriety, and the mutual understanding we shared now allowed us to move closer without fear. It was a late Sunday afternoon when it happened. I had stopped by to drop off some papers for my friend, and she invited me to sit with her in the sunroom. The room was bathed in a golden light, the curtains swaying slightly with the breeze. The faint scent of jasmine from the garden drifted through the open window. She handed me a cup of tea, our fingers brushing once again. This time, the contact felt purposeful, deliberate, yet still tender and safe. We talked, as we often did, about life, about choices, about the future. But now there was a softness in our exchanges, an ease that hadn't been there before. When she laughed, I noticed the warmth in her eyes more keenly, and when I spoke, she listened with a full attention that made my words feel meaningful. There was no rush to define what we were, just a shared presence that was richer than anything I had known. Then, as if naturally unfolding, we leaned slightly closer, our shoulders brushing. She looked at me, and I looked back, and there was a silent acknowledgement in that glance, recognition of the bond we had nurtured, respect for the distance we had maintained, and permission for our connection to exist fully in the moment. I reached out, carefully, resting my hand lightly atop hers. The warmth of her skin, the slight pressure of her fingers against mine, communicated more than words ever could. She smiled, a soft, tender expression that carried relief, joy, and quiet affection all at once. "I think," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "we've both learned a lot about patience, and about noticing what really matters." I nodded, feeling the truth of her words resonate deeply. It was not about age, or boundaries, or social expectation. It was about the slow, deliberate cultivation of trust, care, and genuine admiration. We spent the rest of the afternoon together, sitting side by side, sometimes speaking, sometimes simply enjoying the shared silence. There was no awkwardness, no uncertainty, just a mutual presence, full of warmth, understanding, and the subtle excitement of a connection that had been carefully nurtured. When I left, I felt lighter, more aware, and profoundly grateful. The slow burn romance had reached its natural conclusion, not in dramatic gestures, but in steady, meaningful intimacy. And I knew, in that quiet certainty, that this connection, rooted in respect, emotional depth, and tender affection, was something enduring. It was the kind of relationship that could grow stronger with time, built on patience, shared moments, and the beauty of allowing feelings to unfold naturally. In that moment, I realized that the story had never been about crossing boundaries too quickly. It had been about discovering the extraordinary warmth that can arise from understanding, care, and the courage to embrace subtle, profound love.